Лекция на тему антропология и языкознание. Лингвистическая антропология как область научных исследований. Прочитает эту лекцию профессор, доктор Стивен Пакс Леонард, сотрудник Московского государственного лингвистического университета. Как мы и писали ранее, лекция будет прочитана на английском языке, но я должен сказать, что доктор Леонард на самом деле прекрасно знает русский язык. Я думаю, что исключительно скромность помешала ему прочитать лекцию на русском языке. Но, во-первых, я знаю, что у нас очень образованная аудитория, и я не сомневаюсь, что огромная ее часть поймет то, что будет говорить доктор Леонард. Во-вторых, если будет желание задать вопросы, и кому-то будет удобнее задать их на русском языке, то доктор Леонард наверняка сможет на них ответить и на русском языке, ну и в крайнем случае мы как-то поможем с переводом, так что я уверен, что языковой барьер нам не помешает, и я передаю слово доктору Стивену Леонарду. Пожалуйста.
Спасибо большое. As Dmitry said, today's paper will be in English, but if there are questions at the end in Russian, then I can try and answer in Russian. We'll see how it goes. I'm sorry to test your linguistic skills late on a Sunday evening, but I'm sure you understand just fine. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk this evening about linguistics and anthropology. I'm particularly pleased actually to have this opportunity because in the few years I've been in Moscow, my general impression when I speak to my students about linguistic anthropology is that they don't really quite understand what it is I'm talking about. So I have tried on a number of times to sort of define precisely what this subfield means, but I've not really had the opportunity to flesh it out in the detail, which I will try to do this evening. So it's great to be here with you this evening, albeit virtually. Okay, so there are in fact a number of subfields that pertain to issues of anthropology and language. And many of them have sort of overlapping terms and overlapping research focus. So my first task this evening is to try to sort of sort out some of these terminological issues before going on to explain what kind of research you might expect a linguistic anthropologist to undertake. Then I'm going to talk specifically about my long-term field research in Greenland, and in doing so, hopefully give you an idea of how the domains of language and anthropology interact under the guise of fieldwork. Okay, so there are linguistic anthropologists, there are anthropological linguists, there are sociolinguists, there are ethnolinguists, and then there's a whole universe of social anthropologists who have some kind of interest in language, as well as linguists who are interested in social anthropology. So how do we make sense of all these sort of closely related subfields? Well, to be honest, I could spend an hour or so discussing in detail just this question, but I don't think that would be the best use of our time. So I'll just briefly explain how the territory is divided up. So as you're probably aware, universities in the US and Canada work within the four-field approach to anthropology. That is to say, most university departments they are divided into cultural anthropology, what we in Britain call social anthropology, physical anthropology, archaeology, and linguistic anthropology. Linguistic anthropology always comes in at the end, I've noticed. This subcategorization is in part thanks to Franz Boas's vision of the subject. Now, as you're probably aware, Franz Boas was really the preeminent figure of anthropology in America. And he's responsible for the doctrine, and indeed some people might say the dogma, that underpins the subject, and that is to say cultural relativism. And he was, of course, a champion of indigenous causes and also the preservation of indigenous languages on the American continent. So as such, linguistic anthropology became a subfield of anthropology that focused not on language as a medium of communication, but more as a sort of a shaper of our perception of reality. So Boas argued that language was not just a reflection of our thoughts and ideas, but actively shaped them. Subsequently, these ideas were advanced with the so-called Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which in very simple terms suggests that the language a person uses determines or influences to some degree their thinking or worldview. And I'll return to this notion that the language we use may affect our perception of reality when I talk subsequently about my research in Greenland. Linguistic anthropology can also be found in Australia and New Zealand, thanks to their heritage of indigenous languages. But linguistic anthropology departments are, for the same reason, not generally speaking, found in the UK or in Europe. Here, the academic landscape is quite different. So in the UK, social anthropology had an intimate relationship with colonialism, and it was colonial domination that in fact provided anthropologists with access to so-called primitive communities. We no longer use this word primitive, but we now speak of indigenous communities, but that was the word used at the time. Sir Edward Evans Pritchard's research was even funded by colonial administrations. So historically, social anthropology in the UK, at least, has tended to show, I think it's fair to say, little interest in linguistic issues. Language was basically taken for granted amongst anthropologists and continues to be to this day, not just in the UK, but elsewhere too, I would argue. This ambivalence became arguably more pronounced with the establishment of linguistics as a new, largely Chomskyan discipline in the 1930s and onwards. So I think I'm right in saying, if I remember correctly, the first linguistics department in the UK opened at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, in 1932. But the subject only really became established more broadly in the 1950s and thereafter. And that's because Chomsky's sort of magnum opus, his Syntactic Structures, was published in 1957, and the discipline advanced quite rapidly thereafter. So in Great Britain, at least, linguistics and anthropology have, very regrettably, in my opinion, had little to say to one another. Anthropologists view linguistics as an arcane subject that is preoccupied with abstract, rather mentalist theories, whereas linguisticians, when I use the word linguistician, I mean a scholar of linguistics, not just a linguist. So whereas linguisticians view anthropologists as sort of some kind of anachronism that paddles down the Amazon on rafts in search of the last uncontacted tribe. Of course, neither stereotype is, of course, quite correct. There are a few scholars that seek to bridge the gap, but I cannot say that we have succeeded. When I was at Oxford, I convened every Thursday afternoon the Language and Anthropology seminar. Edwin Ardener, who was my predecessor, had convened the seminar with the same name and the same purpose about 30 years previously. The purpose was to bring linguists and anthropologists together so that they could better understand how their disciplines could benefit from one another. For me, at least, it's absolutely obvious that language and culture should sit together. So this seminar, I have to say, was well attended by anthropologists. They had, of course, already embraced the subfield of linguistic anthropology as is understood in America. And linguistic and social anthropologists share a methodology. And I'll say more about that in a moment. But the seminar, unfortunately, was largely ignored by the linguisticians. So that's very briefly the picture in the UK. In Europe, notice that in the UK, we don't really think of ourselves as Europeans, but in Europe, the division is perhaps less apparent, and the various Max Planck institutes in particular have emerged as interdisciplinary centers of excellence that really care very little for this kind of academic partitioning. So the linguistic anthropologist Stephen Levinson is a case in point. I think he would agree to the title linguistic anthropologist. He's written a number of excellent books on things like spatial grammar, as understood by speakers of indigenous languages. So, despite being British and having a PhD in linguistics and not anthropology, I consider myself to be a linguistic anthropologist. This is sometimes a problem, but I consider myself a linguistic anthropologist. That's because, quite simply, all of my work is grounded in fieldwork and the participation observation methodology. I'm also more interested in holistic issues and systems than the sort of scientific study of language. The other reason I consider myself a linguistic anthropologist is because this particular subdiscipline is open to employing phenomenological approaches. That is to say, it is willing to engage with the branch of philosophy that is related to experience and language, and I'll say more about that later on. In the UK, so coming back to the UK, the only aspect really of linguistics that is interested in language, society, and culture is sociolinguistics. My PhD supervisor used to like to remind me that, and I'm quoting him now, he won't mind me saying this, he used to say that sociolinguistics is not real linguistics. And I always thought that was an extraordinary statement, because language for me is surely first and foremost a social phenomenon. However, this statement just echoes Chomsky's assertion that he was not interested in variation. He once famously said, "I'm not very interested in variation." For us, as anthropologists, language surely only becomes interesting once there is variation. So in a nutshell, in the UK and also in Europe, I think it's fair to say that linguistics and anthropology have something of a troubled relationship. Whereas in the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, the coupling of linguistics and anthropology is in fact seldom questioned. I mentioned previously that socioanthropology and linguistic anthropology share a methodology. Both of these sub-disciplines are, of course, founded on long-term ethnography, the participant observation methodology, and a holistic approach, which is concerned with systems as a whole. The overlapping subfield of anthropological linguistics, this is where it gets a little bit complicated, and anthropological linguistics, by the way, can also sometimes be found in American universities, but is generally not found in European universities. Anthropological linguistics also tends to use the long-term ethnographic approach. However, anthropological linguists, as opposed to linguistic anthropologists, tend to be more interested in linguistic structures, as opposed to using the lens of language to answer more holistic questions. As a subfield of linguistics and not anthropology, sociolinguistics does not, generally speaking, use the participant observation methodology. Instead, sociolinguistics actually grew out of the work of William Labov. I don't think William Labov is widely known in Russia, but he's a very well-known American scholar who's must be about, I think he's nearly 100 now. Last time I heard him speak, he was about 92 years old. And he was a very influential scholar from the sort of 1960s and onwards. And he was very interested, or is very interested in linguistic variation and social variables such as gender, class, ethnicity. And sociolinguistics is really quite far removed from linguistic anthropology because it's a data-driven discipline. I've often been, throughout my career, been reminded that in anthropology, we don't have any real data, which arguably is not quite true, but we don't have data in the sense that sociolinguists have, I would say. And sociolinguists tend to use this sort of data-driven approach to create sort of correlations. It's a subdiscipline that is quite urban in focus and quite correlative. They're interested in correlations between social variables and linguistic variables primarily. Sometimes there are some exceptions. Sometimes sociolinguists do fieldwork, but generally speaking, it's not fieldwork in the sort of anthropological sense. That is to say, they don't normally go and live in a community for at least a year, learn the local language, and study an aspect of the local culture through participant observation. So in actual fact, I see sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology as two separate research enterprises, which perhaps started off quite close together, but I think arguably have moved apart since the 1960s or so. Okay, so having sorted out some of the terminological difficulties, let's have a look at what kind of things linguistic anthropologists actually study. This, I think, is the bit that some of my students haven't really understood in the past, so I'll try to explain in more detail here. So unlike linguisticians, linguistic anthropologists are primarily interested in linguistic performance and not the Chomskyan notion of linguistic competence and universal grammar. For those of you who have studied any linguistics or know anything about Chomsky, you'll know probably that he's always talking about this notion of competence and universal grammar. It's a very different approach to language, as opposed to one that's sort of driven by the language culture interface. So as such, linguistic anthropologists then tend to be interested in topics such as different comparative frameworks for the study of linguistic registers associated with particular social practices, language contact and related outcomes such as bilingualism, code switching, ways of speaking, creolization, language death, variation and cultural patterning in sign languages, gestures, the value of linguistic diversity, conversation analysis, form and function in ritual speech. You won't find any sociolinguists studying ritual speech. Language and identity, agency and language and power structures. That's a very popular theme at the moment. Language and indexicality, language ideologies. I could go on, but I think you get the idea. Now, you may have noticed in that rather long list, I made no sort of mention of grammatical description. I wasn't talking about linguistic reconstruction in the sort of Indo-European philological sense. Instead, linguistic anthropology is concerned with the role played by language and other semiotic resources in the constitution of society and in its cultural representations. And to pursue this goal, linguistic anthropologists have ventured into the study of everyday encounters using perhaps conversation analysis, language socialization, ritual and political events, verbal art, language contact, language shift, notions of literacy, language in the media, and so on and so forth. Now then, in my own work, I have, along with Alessandro Duranti, who is the editor of the Companion to Linguistic Anthropology, which I can very much recommend, by the way, as an introduction to this subfield. I think it's probably the best book out there. I think it's now in its third edition. Together, we've tried to promote a more phenomenological approach to speech in particular and experience by exploring the question of the ideological constitution of language. And it is that subject to which I wish now to turn my attention. So after I returned from 12 months of fieldwork with a group of remote Inuit hunters living in northwest Greenland, I was left asking questions such as, what is the relationship between speech and experience? What is the experiential quality of speech? Now, at first glance, these seem like rather peculiar questions because speech and experience are surely inextricably tied together through habitual practices. And the apparent inseparability of speech and experience renders such questions problematic, for we cannot get beyond or outside of language by means of language alone. My fieldwork in Greenland showed how moments of what I call phenomenological awakening might help us understand better local indigenous ideologies of language, and how this could shed light more generally on the relationship between experience and speech. So to contextualize this, let me begin with a sample from my fieldwork notes. And I'll just read this out as a sample. I'm sitting in a tent on the Murchison Sound, a stretch of water that is completely frozen for 5 months of the year in the high Arctic. 3 men, clad in bearskin trousers and reindeer skin anoraks, sit huddled together listening to a storyteller regale his company with an account of a polar bear hunt. The nasal voice pauses. The story talks of an accident that happened. A young hunter was dragged under the ice. The storyteller begins to cry. The listeners respond by crying almost simultaneously. Tears are quickly wiped away, and the storyteller moves on to a new account. The storyteller's voice is creaky and breathy, speaking in a slow, steady rhythm, in an authoritative, uninterruptible tone. It is a way of speaking in a primordial voice that takes you back to the rootedness of human language, to the interiority of words, as if the Nuna, that this word Nuna means like the local cosmos, as if the local cosmos is speaking through them. Okay, well, by the rootedness of human language, what do I mean? I mean, I have in mind notions such as the transformation of sound into meaning, the precedence of language to human knowing, and the connection between rationality and corporeality. This sense of rootedness comes from the fact that the speech of the storyteller is guided by his environment. The people I lived with are called the Inuhui. And when the Inuhui, who are a subgroup of the Inuit who live in northwest Greenland, when they speak, they listen at the same time to the sounds of nature. So speech is therefore used in a rather measured way. Speech is not just verbal noise, but words are carefully listened to. So as we'll come on to see, speech and experience in this community are shared not just between the speaker and the listener, but potentially cross-naturally, i.e. between humans and non-humans, by which I mean animals, plants, and gods. So Inuhui society is a communal shared language culture based on the notion of what is called biliraktigenik, which means cooperation. It's a language is shared amongst the community, but also its ancestors, and also, as I say, potentially the non-humans. So Inuhui social life is centered on a culture of listening. Young people are expected to listen carefully to older members of the community. And this culture of listening is nurtured through storytelling, which in turn encourages the Inuhui to listen to the sounds of the natural environment. As an example of the culture of listening, the old word for November, the month of November, is duhatut, which means hearing news from other camps, and is a reference to the time when the sea ice used to form. The sea ice was basically the highway, if you think of it in those terms, that connected all the Inuhui settlements along the coast. One of the questions I was trying to tackle in this research was, as I say, what is the relationship between speech and experience, both from the perspective of the Inuhui and from the perspective of myself as language learner and ethnographer. So this piece of research was grounded in an approach which raises questions about conceptions of speech as understood in the Western intellectual tradition. I don't use the terms language and speech interchangeably. When I discuss the former, I'm referring to language as a sort of an autonomous system and typically not speech. However, my focus here is on speech as opposed to language per se, for the Inuhui fulfill communicative intentions through speech and very, very seldom through writing. I'll say more about writing later. So by analyzing the Inuhui's experiential awareness of speech and explicit understandings thereof, I intend to sort of determine how the Inukhui's ideological constitution of language is embedded in language sharing. The intention is also to show how speaking can become the essence of consciousness and how ethnography enables us to investigate epistemological explanations for the life world of language from the experience of the subject. By life world of language, I mean the cultural world as experienced or lived through the framework of the spoken language's patterns. So each language draws on distinctive linguistic patterns, singling out certain objects, events, and relations. And according to Schutz, these linguistic patterns correlate with what the users of the language, especially its native speakers, find typically relevant. So I'm interested in the connections between language and the lived experience in the broadest sense, an approach that will take in the language of humans, human and animal communication, which I'll say more about in a moment, and the Inuit non-verbal world. So in this vein, I'm following in the footsteps of the social anthropologist Magnus Kors, who addressed the question of what an ontological grammar would look like from the perspective of an indigenous group. This kind of grammar would surely predate any sort of notion of bifurcation of the subject and the object. What if we were to turn the world upside down and indigenous groups were to document our grammars? The results would, I suspect, be profoundly different. The Inukhui, they live in 5 different settlements that occupy the size of Germany. The word Inukhui, or Inukhwa in the singular, is a self-imposed demonym, and it means the big or the great people. They number approximately 800, and they speak an Inuit dialect referred to as Polar Eskimo by linguists, and Kanamitan or Manamitan by themselves. The language they speak is not the language they write. Polar Eskimo does not have a fully standardized written norm. They write in Standard West Greenlandic, which is a related Inuit dialect first written down in the mid-19th century. All the Inukhui are literate, but literature, whether written in West Greenlandic, Danish, or English, is not always greatly valued by many and sometimes frowned upon as emblematic of a Western epistemology and way of learning. The Inukhui are schooled in West Greenlandic and Danish, if there are no West Greenlandic speaking teachers available. The Polar Eskimo language is closely related to the dialects of Inuktitut, which is spoken on Baffin Island in Canada, whence a large number of the settlers came in various waves of migration in the 19th century. Phonologically, the language shares much more with the Canadian Inuktitut dialects than the dialects of Greenland. The Inukhui believe that when you are hunting on the sea ice, as we see in this photograph here, you learn to listen. You become a duha hunga, which means a listening person, as a number of hunters used to tell me. Nukapyangwak, who was a local hunter who helped me train my dog team, used to often tell me to be nipaicho, which means silent when out on the ice. Nipaicho means literally without a voice. The stem nipi means voice. So if you cannot listen, you cannot expect to hear or understand the language of the animals, the rivers, and the winds. Speech itself is for them a vehicle for sensibility, a notion which is lost in any strict formalist take on the language, particularly any kind of formalist notion that a linguistician might have of a language at least. So a good storyteller's voice is one that carries you, for instance, through the landscape where the words express an emotional encounter with the world. The storyteller's voice opens up a field of sublimated meanings, sometimes etched into the landscape through mnemonic place names, i.e. the place name itself reminds you of something because the stem or the affix, there's something inherent in it relating to the activities that took place there in that particular spot. The voice is the sonic embodiment of all that is found in the Nuna. Nuna, as I say, this word for the local cosmos, the animals, the birds, the fish, but also the voices of those that have traveled previously the same tracks. So as such, voice then is both sort of intervocal and intersubjective. is the voices of animals and the sea ice intermingling together with the human voice. As we will see later on, one specific manifestation of the intersubjectivity of voice is to be found in the tradition of throat singing, and I'm going to say a little bit about that at the end. Social memory in such communities often comprises the memory of a certain voice, as language for the Inuit is first and foremost okauchi. Okauchi means speech. The written language, or the written norm, which, as I mentioned, is a different language, strictly speaking, it's Standard West Greenlandic. Standard West Greenlandic, or SWG, to use the linguist term, has very different undertones of social power and authority for the Inuhui. Okauchi, this word for speech, it comes from the verbal stem okak. Okakdok means says that. Okauchi is the word for words or language, and okak is the word for tongue. For the Inuhui, language is speech, and speech is words. The standardized written form comes with all kinds of ideological baggage, because, well, primarily because it indexes the strained political relationship between the capital Nuuk, which is, over 1,000 miles away, and all the politicians that live there, and the people that live the traditional life in the remote regions of Northwest Greenland. This is an extremely remote corner of the world, and they feel like the people, the politicians living in Nuuk have completely forgotten about them. And to a large degree they have, because most of them have never been there, to this part of Greenland. There is still a spiritual agency present for many of the hunters. I just want to come back to hunting now, when they're out on the sea ice. So this agency, do you remember when I was giving the list at the beginning about the subjects that linguistic anthropologists are interested in? I spoke about language and agency. This agency is embodied in the voice, which represents a total involvement with the surrounding landscape, but is nowadays increasingly hard to find. The life of the Inuhui is no longer determined by the natural environment in the way that it once was. Up until the 1950s, the community was more or less based on subsistence hunting. But these storytellers' voices, however, remain an important part of the cultural memory. So for the Inuhui, a storyteller should have a sonic presence, and this quality comes from the directionality of the voice towards his or her inner voice, as well as towards the healer. Healer is the word for consciousness and mind, but also the word for weather and climate. So if you say, for instance, hila namangicho, that means the weather is bad, but it also means I have a headache. For the Inuhui, a story is much more than just words. A storyteller's voice can have life energy. It's a spiritual foundation, and a good storyteller should be adept at communicating this energy by portraying a vision of proximity to the natural world. So it's an experiential bond between the storyteller and the listener. A story is a gift. It's an act of sharing. Stories present a way of respecting and living in both the physical but also the psychological worlds. The psychological aspect, I think, is very important and probably misunderstood by many anthropologists, myself included. It's a means of making sense of the world that man shares with animals. As well as sharing stories, members of this small community share views about the ideological constitution of their language. So following the linguistic anthropologist Paul Cross-Greety, language ideologies should be understood as beliefs or feelings about language as used in their social worlds. So I tackle this question using long-term participant observation ethnography to understand, as far as possible, the belief systems that underpin these indigenous conceptions of language within their social worlds. I'm attempting to explore the practical implications of these speakers' beliefs about how their own language is used. This research is based on the assumption that tapping into the life worlds of different language communities offers untold riches and has the potential to reconfigure our understanding of language. Ethnography of this sort shows how ideology colonizes our thinking about relationality and how estranged from our actions we have become. What is more, when we attempt to understand indigenous conceptions of language in an ethnographic context, we are more likely to capture an informant's sort of meta-linguistic awareness as the ethnographer begins to understand the subtleties of an utterance's social and cultural context. By meta-linguistic awareness, I mean here simply the tendency to reflect on language beyond the semiotic level, the full-meaning relationship, which you might argue is something of an obsession with the linguisticians, at least, but not with the anthropologists. The approach advocated here is one that brings to the foreground the importance of what one might call zones of perception in the background. So by zones of perception, I mean the subtle layers of spatial and acoustic awareness that we might not encounter every day. It is a phenomenological approach where enactments of language are themselves modes of experiencing the world. I keep talking about phenomenology, so let me be clear about what I mean by that. Phenomenology is the philosophy of experience. It's a method of reflective attentiveness that focuses on the individual's first-hand inner lived experience. Phenomenology allows us to focus on the ways in which experience is embodied and emotional. Being embodied means being involved in one's life world, inherently connected to one's environment in an ongoing sensual interrelation. The body is the locus from which our experience of the world stems. Merleau-Ponty, who developed this notion of phenomenology, was very much interested in body and gestures and how we express ourselves, not just verbally, but also through our movements of our body. A phenomenology of speech aims to determine the place of speech with regard to the totality of the human experience. It examines how the perception of speech and voice takes form in people's lives. And in this regard, I'm making the case for language itself being indexically part of the world as opposed to language indexing objects extrinsically in the world. So language and experience then are sort of conjoined. And my fieldwork with the inner Hui attempted to understand the nature of this entanglement from their perspective. Of particular interest were ethnographic moments of disjuncture, or what might be referred to as existential aporia, when we sense a slight sort of disentanglement of experience and language, a sense of consciousness of ourselves and our world. Our default pre-reflective experience is that we do not notice language. And that is why perhaps most anthropologists simply take it for granted and don't really bother studying it in the way that linguistic anthropologists do, at least. So in a normal conversation, we don't normally have time to consider the sensual impact of words, do we? I mean, moments of heightened linguistic consciousness, such as in a language learning context, permit, however, I think, a particular articulation of the conceptual understanding of language. Once speech is reduced to its elementary level of phenomenological factors. Subsequently, we'll take a closer look at one of these phenomenological awakenings, and that is, as I say, throat singing. By the term phenomenological awakening, I mean simply the effect of any communicative act that results in a sense of actually living in the metaphysical reality of speech. In such an instance, words and the voice uttering the words become something more than merely a complex linguistic expression. Through these awakenings, we gain a new sense of how a living language actually operates in our minds, I think. Phenomenology shows firstly that language and consciousness are intertwined. Experience no sooner comes into consciousness than it becomes penetrated by linguistic forms. The forms of language stand initially as a conscious analogy for the forms of the world, but a communicative act can trigger a meta-linguistic awareness at certain moments of existential aporia and sentience, when for a moment our metaphysical distance from the corporeal world is disturbed. Any ethnographer, and indeed language learner, I think, working in a foreign language community will be aware of these kind of phenomenological awakenings. Language can be particularly apt, I think, at turning on sort of sensuous codes in our brain when it is only partially understood, when the listener is grasping for the meaning, but his or her ear receives part semantic meaning, part music. Through endless repetition and use, the strangeness of a new linguistic form soon dissipates and seeps into the world of signification. This sense of linguistic wonder and surprise is lost. When the voice or language is new and unfamiliar, it offers an immediacy, a sense of dynamism, doesn't it? Learning a new language, one is confronted with new linguistic forms all the time, and one appreciates signs in a broader symbolic context. And as language learners, we dwell constantly on language, but language is, of course, more than words. Our reflections can be holistic too. At an early stage of language learning, the ethnographer is effectively listening to music. It's a taxonomy of signs. And listening is also phenomenological because one peels away or is even unaware of the symbolic meaning so that only the thing itself remains. However, as the new language becomes more familiar, this language concept distinction present in this heightened linguistic consciousness blurs. The new words are initially objects of acoustic subjectivity. Their sensory appreciation can be different for each listener. Our minds settle on the most salient phonological features of a language, which may vary depending on the listener's mother tongue. An ethnographer is acoustically very aware of the new sounds and their different and strange combinations. Initially, one might struggle to differentiate the new phonological clusters. The new sounds will provoke all kinds of visual and acoustic associations. These moments of linguistic consciousness are significant, for they permit insights into language which are otherwise rendered absent through what Heidegger calls Gerede, which is the German for sort of idle talk, or habitual linguistic practices. Speech might be perceived to be locked into culturally determined symbolic forms. However, for phenomenologists, speech constitutes and presupposes the world in which it is embedded. The implied indexicality is not vis-a-vis the world, but is inward-looking. Consider the emphatic pronoun I, with the hands pointed into the body and the slow, careful articulation of the word. These actions bring the referent, here the person, into being. As we'll come on to see, in a community where a repertoire of gestures are shared by a small number of people who interact on a daily basis, there is a sense of embodied indexicality. Gestures are not only what we do with our bodies, they're also communicated through intonation patterns and a variety of paralinguistic features. Okay, so this research was based on, I mentioned 1 year, but it was actually based on 15 months field work in Northwest Greenland. Initially, I spent a year in the field in 2011, living and traveling and hunting with the Inuhui hunters on the Arctic sea ice. And then subsequently, I returned to the field site for shorter periods of time in 2013 and again in 2014. Throughout my fieldwork, I got to know the great majority of the community, but at the time of 2011, there were only about 40 active full-time hunters. Today, with the rapidly melting sea ice, the number might be half that. The relevant findings for this research were made during participant observation ethnography with hunters and storytellers. The majority of storytellers are hunters and retired hunters, but there are exceptions. Almost all the Inuhui do not respond well to interview-based research, for this line of questioning is considered too direct and intrusive. Answers tend to be tangential at best, and sometimes, in fact, in the form of a story, but not one that is necessarily relevant to the question. Structured interviews were only used with somebody called Masangwak Kukichok. Masangwak is a poet and also a teacher. He's a bit unusual in that community. He's lived previously in Denmark and is I suppose because of his exposure to the Western way of doing things, he's more familiar with the interview approach. Masangwak is the only poet I'm aware of who has published his work in Polo-Eskimo and not Standard West Greenlandic. He has not lived in the community for many years. He lives now in South Greenland, but remains very interested in the traditional way of life where he grew up. My field work was conducted in Polo-Eskimo. I had to learn this language, but initially I used Danish, which is a language which I speak Norwegian and Swedish, and I can turn my Norwegian into Danish just about, but it does lead to some misunderstandings. Interviews with Misangwak were, however, conducted in mainly English and Danish. He's trilingual. But the key words were expressed in Polo-Eskimo or Kanamatan. So we create ourselves through speaking. That's one of the ideas that I'm trying to make here. And in fact, we create ourselves through word selection. And words are not ideographic blank slates. They have, remember, Mikhail Bakhtin was always talking about this, they have long and complicated social histories. Each word has a social history of usage being passed from speaker to speaker, community to community, and embed indeed the tiniest of cultural connotations. A notion important to a storytelling community, and also I think the phenomenology of speech, is that we create ourselves through not just word selection, but also through the what you might call the indexical footprints of voice. This is not the same as saying language shapes experience, coming back to the Sapir-Whorfian idea. But we choose words that tell us something about who we are and how we utter them, and the voice we use adds another personalized dimension. So voice then is perceived to be the vehicle of agency, where it has a kind of primacy in the formation of true communities. Language is a primal activity of self-creation, where word selection is not an entirely subconscious experience, I would argue. In this regard, Leontiev, the Russian linguist, referred to, he was talking about linguistic personalities. He referred to linguistic personalities whereby we create linguistic forms of self-expression. We all, in fact, nurture, of course, our own idiolects, to use that sociolinguistic term. We forget that speech is the process of self-identification through thinking. The words and the voice, as Merleau-Ponty used to say, bring you the person. The philosopher Agamben builds on this, making the important observation that we integrate linguistic symbols into how we understand the entities denoted by these symbols. So in his example, being called shoe as in like Orbov, is part of our idea of shoe. So the form, he argues at least, the form is psychosomatically integrated into the meaning. So words can thus themselves be potentially exposures of being. And through habitual linguistic practices, phonosemantic strings become established in the mind of the listener. Now, linguistic signs are therefore, to an extent, inseparable from what makes them meaningful. And this is fundamental to the Merleau-Pontian phenomenology of language. Once in Oxford, I gave a lecture on this and the phenomenology of language to the linguisticians, and they weren't remotely interested in any of these notions, but these tend to be interesting, at least to linguistic anthropologists. If we are to understand how language becomes a meaningful entity in its own right, as a distinct aspect of communicating in the life world of its speakers, then these kind of questions that I'm raising here, I think, merit further exploration. Okay, so putting the historicity of words to one side, a phenomenology of speech grounded in long-term ethnographic fieldwork such as this is an embodied approach to understanding the relationship between experience and speech. A phenomenology of speech concerns itself with existential meaning and language as a lived experience. Yeah, so Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, and all these other phenomenologists are always talking about the lived experience. Yeah. So as speech and experience are conjoined in normal habitual speech practices, the phenomenologist is left looking for acts of consciousness to determine what exactly the nature between the two is. An act of consciousness is often felt by he or she who stands apart from the relevant language life world. Once again, herein lies the power of ethnography. One might ask, if speech and experience are conjoined in the manner in which phenomenologists suggest, how can speech be a gateway to experiencing the world, as Martin Heidegger indicated? Speech acts as a gateway because the experiencing of the world appears in the words as they are uttered. So a one-to-one correspondence is being created between the perception of speech and its further interpretation for the purposes of reaching a higher level of understanding between speech agents. As we will see, certain ethnographic awakenings might be the gateway to this higher level, and in turn reveal something about the feel of language. That's another good example of the difference between sort of linguisticians and linguistic anthropologists. Linguistic anthropologists are perfectly happy talking about the feel of language, but this means nothing normally to a linguistician. So one such fieldwork experience relating to the feel of language might be listening to a story in a tent, as I described in my opening scene when I was reading from my field notes. So a story in a tent, sitting on the frozen Murchison Sound during a whiteout. The Inukhui word for whiteout is bishuahok. This is a very dangerous kind of wind that comes from the northeast and reduces visibility to basically zero. And something that I experienced a couple of times, and it was, whilst it was a bit scary, it was conducive to the best storytelling in my experience. The Inukhui, so staying with that notion of dangerous winds, the Inukhui still consider themselves to be hilakatigit. Hilakatigit means those who share the weather, the wind, and the air. So with the howling wind outside, the hunters listen to the story with a sense of commitment. And such moments where absolutely everything seems sonorous, everything has a sound, unlock the potential to reveal the sensation of language. Maybe I'm getting too romantic here. I don't know. I probably am. It's one of my flaws, but I think you probably see where I'm going with those ideas, at least. When the storyteller speaks, his voice merges with that of the elements, giving them and the landscape a coherence. For storytelling is inherently local and place-based. Through speaking, storytellers are almost always men, there are a couple of exceptions. Through speaking, he creates not just himself, but also his connections with the environment, perceived as an extension of his psyche. Don't forget this notion of healer, meaning mind and consciousness, but also weather and climate. I mean, climate change for them is not just a practical problem, it's also a philosophical problem because the healer is an extension of their mind. And if you're destroying your environment, you're destroying yourself, literally. You're doing away with your mind and your psyche. I mean, it's a fascinating notion, right? But anyway, yeah, back to storytelling. Yeah, so through speaking, he creates not just himself, but also his connections with the environment, perceived as an extension of his psyche. So storytellers then are memory systems. But in storytelling, it is the act of speaking in a storied way, or at least this is my impression. Not everybody would agree with this, but speaking in a storied way that is as important as the content. So storytelling is a social, humanizing occasion. And in this society, the familiar, heavy, nasal voice, often of an older man, of a hunter, brings people together after the hunt. The storyteller's voice conjures up the Arctic environment outside from which the hunters are seeking refuge, sitting together and enjoying the warmth and the coziness of the hut or the tent. The storyteller feels a sense of empowerment as he sits at the intersection of the focus of cosmic forces, the center of the universe, if you like. For the listener, the voice indexes and resonates with a sensorial intimacy with the living land as he is immersed in a transcendental cosmos. once again, I might be getting too romantic there with some of my ideas and notions, but I'm happy running with that for the moment. The voice does not just create the speaker, but it points to what a semiotician would call an isomorphism between language and the natural environment. So where they line up perfectly. In order to investigate how a remote Inuit subgroup known as the Inahui makes sense of speech, a holistic phenomenological approach is then employed. Such an approach allows us to comment on the experience of speech and leaves the door open to indigenous views of what this is. However, it is challenging to ascertain what their local ideology of language is, and indeed whether the term language lends itself to ethno-linguistic description in this context. Attempting to describe linguistic ideologies of indigenous groups using our own assumptions might not help much either. It is a difficult task to unpack speakers' linguistic ideologies, even if the Inahui make references to the language's indexicality. For instance, the Inahui are strongly aware of the phonological resemblances between their dialect and certain dialects of Alaskan Inupiaq. And thus there is an appeal to a sort of a pan-Inuit linguistic identity. However, in the bi-dialectal settlement of Savissivik, population 30, the speaking of Kanamitan, as opposed to the Ubenavik dialect, which is the dialect spoken slightly further south in West Greenland, indexes the Ubenavik dialect of West Greenland indexes a shared ancestry and thus a sense of legitimacy with regards to local notions of belonging, a fact which visitors are constantly reminded of. The Inahui's linguistic ideologies are seldom explicitly articulated. You probably won't be surprised to hear that, but instead are subtly embedded in cultural practices. And here is, of course, the job of the social anthropologist to disentangle this aspect of how they're embedded. These cultural practices show most obviously that the Inahui dwell in a cosmos of animist connections and not Cartesian dichotomous distinctions. Yeah, so Descartes had this notion of humans and their environment being totally distinct, yeah? But the use of the word healer, which I mentioned previously, for instance, is indicative of this refusal to separate mind and nature. As I say, when the weather was bad, hila namingicho, which in their terms, by the way, meant when there was mist or fog, buyok, or a low dense cloud, giving a feeling of oppression or closeness. This is when it was often quite dangerous to hunt. But it was at times of hila namingicho that people would complain of headaches. So as I say, bad weather and headache is the same phrase in Polar Eskimo. Language for the Inahui then does not mediate the ontological separation of nature and society, which is very much embedded in Western notions, isn't it, of environment. I mean, just look at the notion of sort of national parks in America, right? They're sort of these parts of nature that are sort of fenced off for human enjoyment. They're seen as something totally separate. So the Inahui's sense of non-dualism, this is the point I'm trying to make, is not only concerned with the man-nature distinction, but also with all manner of distinctions, such as animal and human. I would argue that their distinction between animals and humans is not quite the same as ours, between body and language, nature and language. We take these for granted, but we shouldn't necessarily assume that these distinctions are universal, or at least perceived to be universal. Evidence is found for this in a sort of isomorphism that seems to be perceived between language and the so-called Nuna, the word for local cosmos. It would be going too far to say that the Inahui view their languages emanating sort of iconically from the sounds of nature. I don't want to go that far, but I think the resemblance of the hissing, palatal, fricative sounds with the sounds of the wind are, in their view, not coincidental either. So previously, language might have been seen as shaped breath. So in Polar Eskimo, the words for breath, wind, and spirit all come from the same stem, anare. And breath was seen as synonymous with life because the souls of both animals and humans were, anehak, were equated with this notion of anare. It is also the case that language is not only the domain of humans, and thus there are clear synergies with the Amerindian natures of language. Whether the Inahui can hear the language of animals seems to be dependent on social relations. An able hunter or a latent shaman, or not really a shaman, more of a healer maybe, may have access to their language, for instance. A local hunter who was visiting me remarked after a long, prolonged silence, a very long silence is in this community, that he could hear the walruses, the Avek, speaking down by the shore. Yeah, he claimed that he could hear these animals speaking. Ibi, his name is, in my last book, Animals of Solitude, I speak a lot about Ibi. He was a very funny character. Ibi could hear that the walruses were speaking to one another, but could not catch the meaning because he could not make out the words as they were so far away. He believed that he would have been able to understand the meaning of the walrus speech had they been closer. This could have been one of those famous sort of Margaret Mead moments where the locals were spinning me a yarn, but it's difficult to say. I don't think so, but it's not impossible. Other hunters told me how they could sense the presence of a narwhal before they saw it. The Inupiat whalers of Alaska have spoken of how they know when a whale gives itself up to you. This is the phrase they use, that the animal gives itself up to you. They believe that whales listen to humans and that if humans speak badly of whales, their hunting trip might end badly. The hunters I worked with expressed similar opinions, but not vis-a-vis whales because this isn't a whaling community. Well, there are narwhals, but not other kinds of whales. Well, there are, but they're very seldom. There was a belief that whales, so narwhals and the occasional killer whale, which turns up in August, had agency and could communicate their needs to people. So in my community, hunters still sometimes give water to a seal they have killed to ensure a safe passage into the afterworld, into the spiritual world. So animals play a role in the inner life of the Inuit, and their acoustic presence in particular is undoubtedly a feature of the local language ideology. Yeah. So even today, when the Inahui are no longer semi-nomadic as they were in, say, the 1950s and 1960s, many now live in more sedentary lives in small towns. Even despite that, the various animal sounds, I would argue, are still of great significance and still somehow make up their notion of what language is. So the howls of sledge dogs at different times of the day, especially at feeding times, act like time markers, for instance. People know the time because of the feeding of the dogs. The first hearing of the little auks, these funny little black and white birds that appear in their millions on the same day of the same week of the same month of May each year, it's quite extraordinary. That is also, a form of indication of time. So Inuit myth and culture, then, I'm trying to argue, interweave sort of human personifications of humans and animals. In one of her incarnations, Sedna was the Inuit goddess of the sea and marine animals, and Sedna famously married a dog and had dog children. This is Inuit mythology for you. Other myths talk of women turning into bears, and there are many Inuit narratives that relate how animals originated from human beings. I mean, for us, that seems very strange, but for Inuit of a previous generation, I don't think that would have been strange at all. The sea mammals, in the same myth, the sea mammals grew out of the fingers of a young woman. The narwhal grew out of an old woman, and the ptarmigan, if you don't know, is a bird that looks a bit like a pheasant, a bit like a partridge. The ptarmigan was said to have grown out of a child. But as far as I know, neither Inuit myth nor the complex system of Inuit taboos said anything explicitly about where their language came from. At least I've never come across such a reference. However, there is an implied assumption that communication, be it verbal or otherwise, was never problematic between animals and humans. That is very clear, I would say. Shamans used to sing songs to persuade seals to give themselves up to hunters. I'm going back quite a long time in history now. I don't know when those kind of practices stopped. I would guess maybe around like 1930s, 1940s, that kind of time, or perhaps even earlier. There is a sense that animal sounds were certainly a form of language that some, perhaps most, could access. So as to whether one could hear the language of the animals, it would depend on the relationship the individual had with the animal. So a hunter living in close proximity to animals would typically be able to understand their language, or at least may make that claim. Language in animism might in some cases be an aspect of what Descola, the French anthropologist, calls interiority. But if a hunter living close to animals understands their language, then that implies that it is through the transformation of aspects of physicality, so living and eating together and familiarizing, the process of familiarization, etc., that this sort of commensality is achieved. So references to animals' spoken language were made during my period of fieldwork, but this language was often phenomenologically part of the body and it couldn't really be seen as coherent verbal articulations, which is frustrating for the anthropologist, because that's desperately what he wants to find out, but sadly that wasn't the case. Amongst the Inuit, this I think is widely understood, animals and humans are often perceived to share the same soul, Danek, and this animal language was perceived to be sort of transcendental speech that came from the soul, that came from the Danek. And the language was perceived to be part of the voices, but also part of the stories that were told previously, and the songs that were sung, and all this together hangs together in this notion of healer, is this idea of well, as I say, climate, environment, but also mind and brain, all sort of merged together into sort of one notion. It's difficult for us to conceive, isn't it? So this speech was sometimes in the form of song, such as with the drum dancer and storyteller Ayako Micek and the Arctic Hares. Ayako was a retired hunter, and he lived in the town of Karnak. I say town, I mean population 600. And he composed a song about his encounter with two Arctic hares. He was born in the 1930s, and Ayako's parents believed that he would be the next shaman. I can say more about shamanism later, but shamanism, well, I mean, the Inuhui were Christianized at the beginning of the 20th century, but shamanism continued as a sort of underground sort of movement for some decades after that, it seems. One day, whilst visiting him in the hut he shared with his wife, he introduced to me a drum song that he'd composed many years ago. And he said, Uddu elani tuha lakigiga uklit mabdu edatu okhlotchi kisu tudu hikme. Which means, one day I heard two Arctic hares laughing and talking on the sea ice. He told me this repeatedly, and he was pointing the drumstick. The drumstick was made from a polar bear's penis, and he was pointing this at me. And he told me this story, and he ran back to the settlement called Neke, which is now long been since abandoned. I think it was abandoned in the 1950s, and told everybody about the encounter. As he was unable to keep a secret, the community realized that Ayako could never be a shaman or healer, whatever you want to call it. It's a sort of blurred notion. It's clear that this animal language was a specialized register, and that the hares singing was a turning point in Ayako's life. He used to talk a lot about this story, but he expressed no sense of surprise that he could hear and indeed understand their language. This just came across as something normal. So in Northwest Greenland, it was not only shamans that could cross these sort of communicative boundaries, it seems. As we've seen, certain hunters claim to hear, but not always understand the language of the animals. And it was not uncommon for hunters to speak of dreams. There's a big discourse of dreams in Inuit communities, or in mine at least. So it's not uncommon for hunters to speak of dreams where certain animals, in particular polar bears, would communicate. This intersection of animal-human communicative practices lies at the heart of the notion of harmony, which remains so important for Inuit culture. Despite the continuing emphasis on the culture of listening, a hunter's acoustic upbringing is different now from just a generation ago. The voices of the old ways are falling silent. Hunters told me the landscape does not sound like it used to. There were just a handful of teenage boys in the whole community that want to become hunters. Inevitably, they will know the landscape in a different way, for in 10 to 20 years, the sea ice will presumably have disappeared thanks to climate change. The spiritual quality of the acoustically resonant landscape will not be the same. As Merleau-Ponty implied in the Visible and the Invisible, his book from 1968, nature speaks. It has its own language, but its meaning was characterized by Merleau-Ponty in terms of open horizons and not inside-outside topologies. This is the belief of the Inuit hunters. Language, expression, consciousness, and ideality all feed into the Merleau-Pontian and Inuit linguistic ideology where man and animal are intertwined. The sonic knowledge and consciousness, with its multi-sensory acuity of the previous generation, indexes a totally different life world. The experience of speech is thus in flux. Even if the man-nature threshold crossing notion of healer remains the soul of Inuit thought, the Nuna is no longer, I would argue, the repository of acoustic experiences that it once was previously. But the spiritual meaning has not been completely lost, even if some of the voices have fallen silent. Inuit thought categories are characterized by indeterminacy. As well as this indeterminacy, the opposition between thought and action derived from the assumption of a mind-body dualism is difficult to encounter. If it exists, then the thought is more likely to manifest itself in a shared inner speech, as in the paranormal prompts observed whilst out hunting. On one hunting trip, a group of us was sitting in a tent. A long silence took hold. After an unfeasibly long time, and without saying a word, the hunters suddenly picked themselves up and ran down to the shore. The sea ice was breaking up, and they were concerned they were going to lose their boat. On these occasions, there was a phenomenological and cultural enrootedness of speech in the silence. It was as if the instruction had been given, but I just not heard it. Similar acts of inner speech were shared on a number of occasions. My interviews with Masangwak showed that in accordance with Inuit philosophy, language cannot be divorced from the cosmic order, the universal truth. For this reason, research on language, in the Western tradition at least, is not considered congruent to Inuit way of thinking about language. The fact alone that a researcher asks questions about sense of language means for them that language has already been artificially commoditized, making this kind of fieldwork problematic. The term for research in Greenlandic can be translated as looking for something. The Inuit would prefer to look for language through your senses than to look for it, and once you've found it, examine it. But the feeling of language is not something that should be objectified. It should just happen. Words have metaphysical powers for the Inuit. The language expresses the value of human beings, their powers and primordial unity. It is not the language of ideology, but instead a guide to the local life world, where our focus is what we are perceiving as opposed to how we are perceiving it. The words represent the integrated wisdom that is at the heart of the Inuit psyche. Unlike new standalone nouns, these original nominal and verbal stems are not affected by language contact, which has been minimal anyway. We have the privilege of going back to a very early form of the language, to the original principles and mindset. Amongst the Inuit, there is an understanding that Katluna language, Katluna is the word they use for white men or Europeans specifically, is different from Inuit language, for it is disembodied. Of course, they don't use the word disembodied, but that can be implied for how they talk about it. These differences are not just about syntax, the lexicon and the grammar. They are concerned with ways of speaking, but also linguistic ideologies. Language for the Inuit is not a symbolic representation of the world, but is a part of the life world. It is something that has grown organically out of nature, but is part of the life world. It is something that has grown organically out of nature. So if you take the word for sun, hekinak, it is made up of the base or the stem heke, which means to splatter or to splash forward, plus the affix nek, meaning the action of. The linguist MacLean noted that this kind of word formation expresses a way of thinking akin to the modern theory of Big Bang, which postulates a universe generated by an initial explosion and unceasing expansion. There is also a sense that the Inuit language has lost some of its previous performativity. The magical language of the shamans is now a linguistic fragment of the past. Despite this, hunters still feel that knowledge of the Inuit language is needed to navigate the Inuit world. Another feature of the Inuit language ideology is the overwhelming significance of nonverbal language. Merleau-Ponty said that language is gesture. I made that point previously, and that could be no more true than in this community, where it is facial gesture and voice quality that lend the spoken utterance its illocutionary force, to use that term from Austin, the philosopher Austin. So in this community, raised eyebrows means yes, pinching one's nose at the top means no, the ubiquitous shrug of the shoulders means simply maybe, the tightening of the lower lip against the bottom row of teeth so that the tops of the teeth are showing, with the jaw moving back and forth laterally in a quick rolling motion, expresses, I am teasing you. Non-verbal conversation is characterized by a distinct commonality of facial expressions. This was a point that I made in my notes very early on, and I kept making this point. In a strong oral culture such as this, speech and gesture are the primary focus of meaning, and this is another reason why a study of Inuit language ideologies lends itself to a phenomenological approach. In speech, we move between words without always demarcating the meaning of one form from another. The positivistic approach of explaining language with respect to a set of rules does not at all capture language as it is spoken. It does not capture all the paralinguistic features of speech, the silence, the noise, and the vibrations surrounding language. Storytelling requires a mastery of the paralinguistic features of the language. In the case of Polar Eskimo, a rich and never random repertoire of sighs and groans, and a specific mix of intonation patterns and gestures accompanying particular words and phrases. Certain bundles of these features are used when one listens to a story being told. The particle iye has no specific lexical meaning, but is a back-channeling cue to the storyteller that the listener is engrossed in the story and that he should continue. A very soft, breathy, and drawn-out una is a mild expression of surprise, and a certain two-pitched, low, high groan means, oh, I see, is that the case? The Inuit would reject any objectification of their language, particularly its reification in the written form. Whenever I tried to get them to write the words of their spoken language down, the Inuit would just point to their head. The gesture meant, just try and remember the words, which is quite a difficult task. If you commit it to writing, you will take something away from the language. That seems to be what they were implying. Writing might be perceived by some of the older members of the community as some kind of exterior facade for the inner sonic reality of spoken words. Instead, I suspect these Inuit may warm to a Merleau-Pontian phenomenology of speech concerned with more than the word and embracing all the gestural significations of language, phonemes, voice, intonation, gestures, movement of the body, the way the word resonates with its surroundings, etc. Indeed, the Inuit seem to believe that their language lies at the deep structure of a sensory landscape. A good storied voice is considered to be one that is evocative of natural elements. Whilst not a tradition indigenous to northwest Greenland, relatives on Baffin Island in Canada have tried to introduce throat singing, which is called Gadayak in the local language. They've tried to introduce it to Karnak, the local town. During my fieldwork, I met with a number of throat singers who were visiting Greenland on so-called cultural exchanges. Traditionally, it is only women that throat sing. Contests are held where women face off against one another, creating a pattern of panting sounds. The winner is she who holds her breath the longest or she who does not fall out of sync with her partner. So in throat singing, a singer's vocal cords are lent to another person's breath to create a truly intersubjective song. The objective is one of perfect cohesion with your partner. It is, in a sense, is a kind of sort of sonic microcosm for the Inuk's relationship to Hela. So the notion of cohesion and being in sync is important to the exchange, just as a normal conversation exchange between Inuit should be cohesive and symbiotic. During my fieldwork, I also met solo artists, and the objective for these female solo artists was to mimic the sounds of animals found in the high Arctic, and they were extremely impressive at doing this, I have to say. Throat singing bridges the human-animal divide, the spiritual and the real, for the reason that Gadayak, throat singing, is a hosting structure for meaningless symbols, archaic words, names of ancestors or old people, animal names, and toponyms. It does not communicate ideas and share understanding, but takes the listener back to an Inuit world of human-animal interchangeability. The fulfillment is thus not an intellectual one, but an imaginative one. Throat singing embodies thus the pan-Inuit linguistic ideology of holistic connections and a sense of wholeness that are conjoined in the healer, and emphasizes the bi-directionality of the animal-human exchange. Remember at the beginning I told you that linguistic anthropologists are interested in holistic systems of language. With its reverberations and shudders, the power of throat singing seems to lie in its confluence of the human and the non-human and their being in nature. But it also has a primordial appeal with its raw use of the voice, the sophisticated mimicry being a precursor to music, perhaps. Storytellers in Northwest Greenland do the same. In their stories, they skillfully imitate the voices of the characters and sometimes the animals. Throat singing navigates this channel of ontological continuity between language and nature, human and animal language. Visiting throat singers imitated the sounds of walruses, kittiwakes. A kittiwake is like similar to a seagull, seals and eider ducks, as well as the sounds of the creaking ice and the waves crashing against the shore. The Inuit felt connection to the landscape is reflected in the vocal tradition. One throat singer was able to vocalize two animal harmonies at the same time. She intimated not only the sounds of animals, but also the movements. With their swaying hips, they wished to imitate the seal wriggling on the ice. Throat singing prolongs, therefore, the lived-through emotional encounter with the world and others. We see this same shifting identity between animality and humanity represented in Inuit masks, which Merleau-Ponty himself referred to. The masks conjure up primordial indivision between man and animal. Throat singing seems to hark back to this. The appeal of throat singing lies in the animality and acoustic materiality of the voice. With respect to local ideologies of voice, and in particular storytelling, it is the phonic, the acoustic material quality of voice that is privilege. Throat singing is more meaningful if you look at the world holistically as an integrated whole. The indexicality is again inward-looking. It requires a primordial way of listening, a phenomenological listening, the sensation of hearing in the mind. And it is the linguistic expression itself which is solicited by the primordial perception. Throat singing is meant to tread the line between the human and the non-human by mimicking the soundscape. This effect comes about by manipulating the vocal tract to create overtone chanting where more than one pitch at the same time is sung. Throat singing and long silences are perhaps a window onto a primordial inner world with all its unspoken words and thoughts. The Inuhui seem to believe that the mind of the animal and the human was inextricably linked in a way that the danek or soul is, and that intersubjectivity can be expressed by speech from the soul in the way that Descola, the French anthropologist, described. Analyzing language then as an advanced semiotic system based on abstract rules since the time of antiquity has in a way created, I would argue, impediments for our ability to imagine living language as something central in the way that I've described this evening. It is clear that an Inuhui language ideology would be one where language has not been fully isolated as an autonomous organic structure. To capture these insights, we need to work and understand more closely indigenous conceptions of language, for they have not been subject to the kind of intellectual practices which constrain our approach to conceptualizing language. The act of separating language from its reverberations in the natural world would, for the Inuhui, deprive it of some of its powers. Amongst the Inuhui, there is still even today a sense of the performativity of words, and this was previously shared with non-humans. Voice has resonance, but words have now lost their inherent magical power evoked by Knud Rasmussen 100 years ago, when words could be traded, according to his account. So what is the relationship between speech and experience for this remote group of Inuit hunters? This is how I started this evening's paper. One might consider in conclusion whether in the context of language being shared with animals and in a context where some speakers resist codification and standardization of their spoken language, might the prevailing language ideology for the Inuhui be something akin to a Merleau-Pontian one? Their indigenous phenomenology of speech would perceive the relationship between form and meaning to be one of intimate symbiosis. Historically, when animist traditions, taboo beliefs, and shamanic language still prevailed, and when the bond to nature was even closer, the role of language would have been more evocative than it is today. More evocative still would have been the mnemonic landscape, the contours of the land, the smells of the winds, and the sounds of the creaking ice. Linguistic sound would have been consubstantial with natural sound, integrating language with perceptual experience. For the Inuhui, consciousness is a bodily and embodied relationship with the cosmic principles of Nuna and Hila. This relationship has ontological primacy over any notion of a disembodied language. An Inuhui language ideology can only relate to its spoken form at a sensual, phenomenological level, as we have seen with the modality of throat singing. It embraces the imagination of the spoken words and voice. The reified written form would be, for the Inuhui, an example of how outsiders have shaped language, coming back to that Sapir-Whorfian idea. Hunters have a phenomenological relationship with the landscape because in a Bassoesque manner, events and narratives belonging are indexed through place names etched onto mental maps. So for a whole variety of reasons, it is difficult for the Inuhui to perceive language as an autonomous representational system of denotational code in the way that linguists do, or linguisticians. In a society where many children are considered the embodiment of their ancestors and thus assume the deceased name and kinship term, one might even speculate as to whether the language they use, not just specific forms and genres, but all the language they speak and the words they utter are in fact their own or not. Okay, so I've given you here at length something resembling a linguistic anthropology case study to give you some idea of the kind of things that we, linguistic anthropologists, are interested in. I want to finish this evening by saying a few words about the future of the subdiscipline. It is my impression that out of the 4 fields in the US, which I mentioned at the beginning, linguistic anthropology has always been the smallest part of the pie. It is also my impression, but I might be mistaken, that linguistic anthropology is shrinking slightly. In my own country, Great Britain, social anthropology is struggling to attract undergraduates. Numbers are falling, but not crashing. With the introduction of tuition fees in the UK in 1998, prospective students of social sciences tended to increasingly opt for economics over anthropology, as they believed that studying economics would boost their earning potential upon graduation. Money, money, money. That trend continues today. In the UK, social anthropologists do not engage in linguistic issues any more than they did 20 or 30 years ago. That's my impression, at least. In the meantime, linguistics as an academic subject has grown, and thus approaches to language tend to be increasingly scientific, if you like, to the detriment of more cultural interfaces. More generally speaking, anthropology in the West is struggling with an identity crisis, it seems to me. With the political correct discourse and the onset of the social justice ideology, which has now saturated almost all universities in the English-speaking world, anthropology is desperate to shed its colonial past. We are no longer able to talk about our informants, but instead have to use the word interlocutors. The curriculum at many universities is being decolonized, and so the founders of the subject, such as Evans Pritchard, Malinowski, Marcel Mauss, Benedict, Mead, Boas, and many more, are being removed from reading lists. I recently discussed these developments in more detail in an article entitled The Nihilistic Turn, Dealing with Ethnographic Entanglements. If this trend continues, and for the moment there's every reason to believe that it will, I predict that ethnography and fieldwork risk being classified as a racist enterprise. Were that to happen, it is difficult to see how anthropology could continue as a standalone discipline. It might instead just be considered some kind of exotic sociology. I'm talking here exclusively about anthropology in the West. One might think that by studying language, one could circumvent the so-called woke agenda, but it is difficult to study the cultural pragmatics of a language in the absence of fieldwork. As for anthropological linguistics, which I mentioned at the beginning, and the documentation of indigenous grammars and languages, the problem here remains one of lack of funding. So despite the world losing on average one language a month, there is in fact very little funding available to study, document, and attempt to revitalize these languages. On that slightly somber note, I will stop there and would be pleased to take any questions that you might have.
Stephen, thank you very much. Oh, well, it was fantastic, I shall say, and it's so nice, you know, to listen to the real pure English. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So, well, we do have several questions. Well, let me read them out loud. You probably can see them in Zoom, but I will read them for the audience. So, well, the first one. What can help us agree with Ennius, with Ennius' thought on having 3 hearts for knowing 3 languages?
What can help us what, sorry?
Okay, just a moment. What can help us agree with Ennius' thought on having 3 hearts for knowing 3 languages?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that specifically, but I think I know where the question's going. I think I've been thinking about this recently. I think there is a sense that if you're for polyglots, if someone who speaks various languages, there is a sense that you sort of have to enact that new language. I think every language has its sort of own voice, and that's sort of a subconscious thing. I mean, if I speak another language, I feel like my voice is slightly different, but I'm not doing that on purpose. I think it's a set of deep sort of psychosomatic assumptions and expectations about how I think that language should sound. When I learned French many, many years ago, I lived in France briefly, and it was the time when Jacques Chirac was president. And you can probably remember his televised addresses. He had this very sort of slow, sort of gravelly voice, you know, je me suis fait une certaine idée des choses. And for me, that was like the ideal speaker. That was sort of how French should sound. And I'm not saying that I sound like Jacques Chirac when I speak French, but probably somewhere in the back of my mind, there is a different speaker. So I'm not sure I quite understood the question, but the idea of having different hearts and for different languages, I think I understand that. I think in a way, at least, every language requires a different voice and a different perhaps a different worldview, but that's a bigger question.
Okay, the next question. Does geography influence language, the way we speak or pronounce a word? And if does, could you give an example?
You know, that's a classic question that linguists get asked. Listen, I think impressionistically, I know a lot of people think that is the case. They think people live in very sort of mountainous communities at very high altitude have trouble pronouncing certain fricatives or certain phonemic clusters, but I think actually, in actual fact, there's very little evidence to show that is the case. But it's not a question I've explored in any detail, but I know it comes up occasionally. And as far as I know, there's little concrete evidence to suggest.
Okay.
Certainly in my community where it's desperately cold for much of the year, you know, sometimes people say, "Oh, are there such long silences because of the climate?" You know, no, I don't think there's any relationship there.
So, and one more question for you. Can linguistic anthropology try to prove the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis?
Oh, well, you know, that's an interesting question because Sapir-Whorf hypothesis was very sort of trendy for a long period of time, and then it fell completely out of fashion. I think primarily because of the preponderance of Chomsky in linguistics. But I'm very pleased to say that probably, I think over the last 10 years or so, it's once again become quite an significant question. And it's a question that linguistic anthropologists and linguists, by the way, are increasingly sort of focused on. So I think there's more work to be done. I know Russian linguists are particularly interested in this question and this notion of sort of linguistic consciousness and linguistic worldviews and all that. I wouldn't say there's different interpretations of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and I'm not a sort of a hard Sapir-Whorfian. I don't think that language determines the way we think, but it certainly reflects the way we think, and possibly slightly more than that. And I think, yes, absolutely, linguistic anthropology, those are the kind of questions that we should be concerned with.
Okay, so, and actually there are many expressions of gratitude to you. Thank you very much for such an interesting lecture, and special thanks for the aesthetically attractive visual component. The photo perfectly convey the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Another listener writes, thank you very much for the lecture. So, and of course, we join these listeners, and thank you for your lecture. It was a real pleasure.
It was my pleasure. I'm sorry it was. I hope it wasn't too difficult linguistically, but it sounds like they understood the key messages. That's the main thing.
It was great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. And now I will switch to Russian. So, дорогие друзья, еще раз большое всем спасибо. Мы завершаем трехдневную работу нашей школы. Я хотел бы поблагодарить всех лекторов, которые у нас выступали. Я вижу, что двое из них еще с нами, но поверьте, что мы всех их поблагодарили и поблагодарим. Я, конечно, особенно благодарен сотрудникам нашего Международного центра антропологии, которые вынесли большую нагрузку, пережили, я бы сказал, большую нагрузку, связанную с подготовкой и проведением школы. Это Мария Дмитриевна Аксенова, менеджер нашего центра, и мой заместитель директора центра Глеб Владимирович Александров. И, конечно, прежде всего мы благодарны нашим слушателям, мы благодарны всем вам за интерес, который вы проявили к нашей школе. Я уже в начале, когда открывал школу, сказал, что мы исходим из того, что такой интерес – это интерес не к нам, не к нашему центру, мы, так сказать, не льстим себя такими иллюзиями, это следствие того, что бесконечно интересна наука антропология. Бесконечно интересна наука антропология, и совершенно, на мой взгляд, естественно, что она вызывает интерес у такого большого числа молодых, образованных, интеллектуальных людей. Огромное спасибо всем слушателям за то, что вы нас слушали.